Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, November 11th, 2021. On this Veterans Day, President Joe Biden paying homage to Americans who have served in the military, laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, and praising veterans as the very spine of America, and promising to work with Congress to make sure they get benefits they have earned, calling it a sacred obligation, as the White House announces expanded health care support for veterans exposed to burn pits. A procession at the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery, recreating the procession that dedicated the tomb 100 years ago. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, retired General and Vietnam veteran Barry McCaffrey reflecting on the legacy of that war and of its veterans and how the U.S. has fought wars since. Also today, Vice President Kamala Harris talks about her meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Gutteres, with his not-too-optimistic view about what's likely to emerge from the International Climate Summit, and remembering former South African President F.W. de Klerk, who has passed away. He was on C-SPAN after he left office, talking about why he pushed for an end to the racial segregation policy of apartheid in his country. We begin at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery in Northern Virginia. President Joe Biden taking part in a wreath-laying ceremony on this first Veterans Day of his presidency. President Biden stepping forward to the tomb, bowing his head in front of the wreath, crossing himself, then stepping back and standing with Secretary of Veterans Affairs Dennis McDonough. Biden saluting, McDonough placing his hand over his heart as the military band played taps. Also at the ceremony of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, First Lady Jill Biden and the Secretaries of Defense, Homeland Security, Commerce, Labor, Energy, and State. They all went then across to the amphitheater for the National Veterans Day observance ceremony. VA Secretary Dennis McDonough saying that honoring veterans is not only the job of his department.
This day reminds us that it's not just the job of VA to serve veterans, their families, survivors, and caregivers. It's the job of every American. Because whenever someone signs up to honor our country in the military, our nation makes them a simple promise. If you take care of us, we'll take care of you. If you fight for us, we'll fight for you. If you serve us, we'll serve you when you come home. The thing is, our nation as a whole makes that promise. But it's on all of us, every single one of us, to keep that promise. There are many ways to do that. From reaching out to the veterans in your life, to lending a hand when a veteran needs help, to doing your small part to uphold the principles of democracy for which veterans have fought and bled to defend. Whatever the method, serve veterans and serve them well. Remember their sacrifices, recognize their service, and recommit and renew your pledge to them, because that is our most sacred responsibility as Americans on this Veterans Day and every day.
Veterans Affairs Secretary Dennis McDonough. By the numbers, according to the Pew Research Center, veterans in the United States, total of 19 million, about 7% of the population. The largest share come from the Gulf War era, that's after 1990 service. 7.8 million. Next is the Vietnam War era, 5.9 million. 240,000 veterans alive in the U.S. from World War II, 930,000 or so from the Korean War. President Biden at Arlington National Cemetery saying that veteran service and sacrifice will never be forgotten.
To be a veteran is to have endured and survived challenges most Americans will never know. You've come through the trials and testing, brave dangers and deprivations, faced down tragic realities of war and death. You've done it for us. You've done it for America, to defend and serve American values, to protect our country and our Constitution against all enemies, and to lay a stronger, more secure foundation on which future generations can continue to build a more perfect union. Each of our veterans is a link in a proud chain of patriots that has stood in the defense of our country from Bunker Hill to Belleau Woods, Gettysburg to Iwo Jima, Chosin Reservoir to Konar Valley. Each understood the price of freedom, and each shouldered that burden on our behalf. Our veterans represent the best of America. You are the very spine of America, not just the backbone. You're the spine of this country. And all of us owe you. And so on Veterans Day, and every day we honor that great debt and recommit ourselves to keeping our sacred obligation as a nation to honor what you've done.
President Biden at Arlington National Cemetery. Again, from the Pew Research Center, a study in 2019 found that 72% of U.S. adults, an equal number Republican and Democrat, say if they were making the federal budget, they would increase spending for veterans' benefits and services. This was the highest number in that survey in any of the 13 program categories offered to the population. President Biden today talking about veterans programs and what he says he is improving.
All veterans, service members, their families, caregivers, survivors, I want you to know that our administration is going to meet the sacred obligation that we owe you. We're going to work with Congress, Republicans and Democrats together to make sure our veterans receive the world-class benefits that they've earned and meet the specific care, specific needs that they each individually need. That means expanding presumptive conditions for toxic exposure, particulate matter, including Agent Orange and burn pits. We're going to keep pushing on this front to be more nimble and responsive, reviewing all the data and evidence to determine additional presumptive conditions that make sure our veterans don't have to wait to get the care they need. It also means prioritizing mental health care that's necessary to treat the invisible wounds that so many of our veterans carry, including pursuing our newly released comprehensive public health strategy to reduce military and veteran suicides. I want to say clearly to all our veterans, if you're struggling, you're so used to never asking for anything. If you're struggling, reach out. Call the Veterans Crisis Line. You're having trouble thinking about things. It's no different than if you had a wound in your arm. It's also making sure that the growing population of women and LGBTQ plus veterans receive appropriate services and support. As we continue our efforts to defeat the pandemic and build back better, it means keeping the needs of veterans front and center.
During his remarks, President Biden at Arlington National Cemetery also remembering 3 friends who recently died, all veterans, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, General Ray Odierno, and former Georgia Senator Max Cleland, and as he has done in many of his speeches, remembering his late son, Beau Biden, who was a veteran. Leo Shane is deputy editor of Military Times. He was on C-SPAN's Washington Journal this morning discussing how the president has approached veterans issues in his first year in office.
Leo Shane, let's just begin with the Biden administration. Have things changed under this new president in his first year?
Yeah, it's still hard to tell. I mean, obviously, the president came in during the pandemic. That has really dominated most of the operations and decisions over at the Department of Veterans Affairs. So we got a chance to sit down with VA Secretary Dennis McDonough earlier in the week and ask him what he thinks is different about the department. He's pointing to transparency. He's pointing to their message of inclusion, trying to broaden benefits, trying to find ways to cater to more women veterans, to more minority veterans, LGBT veterans. But really, the COVID issues have just dominated everything. Have dominated the reopening of hospitals to full operations. They've created a backlog in benefits that is probably going to take at least a year, maybe a little bit more to draw back down. So, you know, if we're given report cards, they get an incomplete because it's hard to see just what these other priorities are going to be until the COVID issue is taken care of.
Yeah, and I mean, what is the administration doing to try to address the backlog that is created by this pandemic?
Yeah, so the big backlogs are in medical care and in benefits. So in the benefits section, they've acknowledged that between processing problems that came up with workers having to shut down offices at the start of the pandemic, and with the addition of new presumptive conditions related to Agent Orange, related to burn pit exposure, things that are pretty notable changes under this administration, that it's going to be, the backlog of benefits is going to increase. This is the number of folks who have to wait 4 months or more for their benefits to be processed. They're on a hiring blitz right now. They're going to be training folks. They're going to be doing some overtime. They're hoping to pull that down again over the next 12 to 18 months, back down to what pre-pandemic levels were. The other backlog is this issue of medical care. A lot of veterans deferred routine appointments, cancer screenings, just regular checkups, things like that. They put those off during the pandemic because of concerns about coming into any medical center. So VA has been bracing for a while now as to, you know, are all these folks going to come back in at the same time? How do they make sure that they can deliver care without increasing wait times, without making folks wait even longer? I mean, those annual checkups, especially for annual veterans, are so important because they catch health issues before they become too serious. So right now, VA is looking at, you know, how they can handle that. At the same time, there is a vaccine mandate for all staff that comes due later this month, and they have already started the disciplinary process for some staffers to get dismissed if they won't get vaccinated. So that could aggravate the problem even more.
Leo Shane, the VA Secretary this week was touting improved benefits and services for veterans. What are they doing?
Yeah, well, just an announcement this morning from the White House that they're going to radically rethink how they award benefits related to toxic exposure issues, in particular burn pits from overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan and some of the other war zones of the last 20 years. In the past, this has been a process where they get scientific studies, they take a long time, they connect things, and then you award benefits based on some of those clear service connections. But especially with burn pits, that's been a real problem because there wasn't air monitoring stations going on in a lot of these bases overseas. We don't know what was in these toxic smokes, but we know that that batteries were being thrown in, car parts, all sorts of waste was being thrown in there, and this smoke was going across bases, getting into troops' lungs and giving them respiratory illnesses and cancers. So the Biden administration is saying now they're going to revamp that process over the next 90 days. They're going to really take a close look at a whole range of respiratory illnesses, a whole range of cancers, and take a more generous look at whether or not they should be giving financial benefits to these veterans for injuries that they believe are connected.
Leo Shane, as you know, one of the issues that has dominated debate over veterans has been suicide and how to prevent it. I want to show our viewers what the Veterans Affairs Secretary had to say this week on that.
Mental health services are critical for suicide prevention, so keeping them going during the pandemic has been our primary focus. Fortunately, vets have adapted seamlessly to telemental health sessions, attending 5.6 million sessions already this year, more than doubling last year, 5.6 million sessions. We've also massively ramped up our lethal means safety efforts, putting time and space between veterans in crisis and their firearms by passing out more than 9,500 gun locks this year alone, and by launching an awareness campaign for veterans and their families that's garnered over 1.7 billion impressions.
Leo Shane, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, this is yet another push by VA, a slightly different one, to try and get their arms around this problem of veteran suicide. 17 veterans a day die by suicide. When you include active duty and Guard and Reserve, that number is closer to 20 a day. This new plan is well intentioned. The sticking point is going to be that lethal means safety issue that comes up. I asked VA Secretary McDonough, point blank, are you talking about any sort of proposals where you take away guns, firearms from veterans who are having mental health issues or having emotional stability issues to protect them? And he said, no, we're not looking at any of those sort of issues, but the VA does need to talk about the fact that firearms are used in 70% of veteran suicide deaths. This is by far the largest means by which veterans take their own lives. So they really want to focus in on that issue. They want to explain the availability of things like gun locks, safe storage, things like that. But even those measures have been met from conservatives with howls of you're taking away our guns, you're talking about gun control. And in this past week, I heard it from a number of veterans who said, this is misguided. We shouldn't be talking anything about guns. We should only be talking about the mental health problems and about improving those things. VA's new approach now is we need to talk about both. We need to not only talk about the mental health issues you're facing, but also the danger of an impulsive act and how firearms can worsen that.
Leo Shane, deputy editor of Military Times, on Thursday morning's Washington Journal. The Washington Journal is live every morning at 7 Eastern on C-SPAN Radio and C-SPAN Television. You can find our full discussion with Leo Shane archived at cspan.org. This is Washington Today. Back to Arlington National Cemetery. This Veterans Day is the 100th anniversary of the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. President Warren Harding and former President Woodrow Wilson attending that back in 1921. Today's early morning special program, marking the 100th anniversary, introduced by Allison Finkelstein, Arlington National Cemetery senior historian.
Exactly 100 years ago today, on November 11th, 1921, a grand military procession wound its way through the streets of Washington, D.C. Departing from the U.S. Capitol, it took about 3 hours to cross the Potomac River and arrive here at Arlington National Cemetery. But this was no victory parade celebrating the end of a war. Rather, it was a somber funeral procession to inaugurate a new American tradition, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It is the centennial of the tomb's creation that has brought us together today and compelled us to stage ceremonies that harken back to the events of 1921. Today, you will witness a military procession inspired by the one that carried the unknown soldier to his eternal resting place in 1921. While not a recreation or a reenactment, it is meant to evoke elements of that event. It will include service members from every branch of the military, attachés from around the world, military musicians, soldiers in historic uniforms, and an aerial review. Throughout the procession, I will be providing historical commentary to contextualize it within the history of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. We want you to understand that the events you are witnessing are much more than a spectacle of military precision. They are a living, breathing testament to our nation's unbroken promise to never forget those who have died in service to the United States of America. As the culmination of a year-long effort to commemorate the Tomb's centennial, this procession declares our nation's commitment to memorializing our unknown dead.
Allison Finkelstein is Arlington National Cemetery senior historian starting today's ceremony. Since 1921, remains of unknown soldiers from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam joining the remains of the unknown soldier from World War I at the Tomb of the Unknown. In 1988, though, the Vietnam unknown's remains were identified through DNA testing and then reinterred at a cemetery in Missouri, replaced by a plaque honoring all unidentified soldiers from the Vietnam War era. As Ms. Finkelstein noted, that today's procession included a flyover. She did narrate that. And then there was the procession of military members wearing uniforms from World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, also honor guards from the various U.S. military branches. Here's a portion of that narrated by Specialist Browning from the U.S. Army 3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, whose members, known as Sentinels, have guarded the Tomb of the Unknowns 24 hours a day since 1948.
The commander of troops for today's procession, Colonel Patrick Roddy, is leading the Joint Service Staff consisting of representatives from each service. Next, we have soldiers wearing period uniforms depicting the eras in which the unknowns originate. In 1917, the Army was called upon to deploy overseas to defeat the armies of the German Kaiser in World War I. The forces of tyranny and oppression again threatened our country and her allies with the outbreak of the Second World War after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 by Japan. In June 1950, the Cold War turned hot as American forces joined with the United Nations to resist communist aggression in Korea. Representing the countries who participated in the various 1921 ceremonies are foreign attachés from Australia, Belgium, Canada, the Czech Republic, France, Italy, New Zealand, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and the United Kingdom. The United States Army Band, Pershing Zone, is the premier band of our senior service. Pershing Zone provides musical support for over 2,000 military funerals each year, as well as other ceremonies and special events of national and international significance. The United States Army Band is under the direction of Colonel Andrew Esch and led by Drum Major Robert Moore. Next in formation, Honor Guard Company, 3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, representing the United States Army, commanded by First Lieutenant John Keeley and led by Sergeant First Class John Robinson. Next in formation, Marine Barracks, Washington, represented the United States Marine Corps, commanded by First Lieutenant David Jones and led by Gunnery Sergeant Walter Vaughn.
A portion of the procession today at Arlington National Cemetery on the 100th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier dedication. Veterans Day ceremony is also held today in Washington, D.C. at other war memorials for World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam veterans memorials. Decorated Vietnam veteran, retired General Barry McCaffrey, spoke at the Vietnam Memorial, also known as the Wall. He talked about the legacy of the war and those who fought in it.
When we came home, a lot of us were angry, really angry, and our families were angry. And in my company, the draftees all took off their uniforms, grew their hair, threw away their ID cards, and went back to work. And they've done well. I mean, we had one of our soldiers die in prison. We've got a couple that are multi-millionaires, but basically they went back to farms and jobs and families and education, and they did just terrific. That anger, thankfully, has turned into reconciliation and pride. And when you look at these VA and Gallup poll surveys, it's astonishing. We as Vietnam veterans are proud of our service. Most of us will say in a poll question, if we were asked to do it again, we would. And where I most intensely saw that was during the Gulf War. We were getting 200,000 letters a day. It was just astonishing from people that said, when the Vietnam vets were in combat, I didn't speak up, never again. So I think it was a contribution to the support for the armed forces. What's our legacy? Well, one legacy is, my son's a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. We've had 60,000 killed and wounded in the war on terror. We forget, there was some of these fights that went on in Iraq and Afghanistan at company level are as intense as anything that happened in the Adrang or the Ruhr Pocket or Pork Chop Hill. Unbelievable intensity of combat. I would argue that the best military force we've ever fielded is the current U.S. Armed Forces. And a lot of that was due to the Vietnam, 3 million of us stepping forward and our families and saying, we're going to stand behind these troops. It's an important part of our legacy. The other thing we want to do is we want to tell the political leadership of the country, the democratically elected, pick your party, go vote in the primary, but at the end of the day, use military force as a last resort. Not because you fear we have inadequate power, because you never know how war will turn out with an intelligent, desperate enemy. Achieve your objectives, write down what you're trying to do. The second thing, you got to go to the American people and explain what you're doing and ask for support and keep them engaged. If you don't do those two things, we urge you to not deploy the armed forces. We've all got, lots of us got children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren are starting to appear. We're starting to get older. We want to remind the country, to include our own families, that when the country asks you to serve, step forward and do it.
Barry McCaffrey, retired U.S. Army general, recipient of 3 Purple Hearts medals for injuries sustained during his service in the Vietnam War, today at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, the Veterans Day program. Barry McCaffrey also later going on to be the director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or the Drug Czar, in the White House. Associated Press reporting in honor of Veterans Day, a group of Democratic lawmakers reviving an effort to pay the families of black service members who fought on behalf of the nation during World War II for benefits they were denied or prevented from taking full advantage of when they returned home from war. The new legislative effort would benefit surviving spouses and all living descendants of black World War II veterans whose families were denied the opportunity to build wealth with housing and educational benefits through the GI Bill. The House bill, co-sponsored by Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina and Seth Moulton of Massachusetts. The Senate bill introduced by Raphael Warnock of Georgia, who is the son of a World War II veteran. In Paris, France, Vice President Kamala Harris continuing her trip there, attending the European equivalent of a Veterans Day ceremony, Armistice Day, marking the armistice that ended World War I, November 11, 1918, ceremony at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. France 24 reporting that French President Emmanuel Macron led tributes to the last French resistance fighter from World War II, who died last month and will be buried with a cross carved from the wood of Notre Dame Cathedral. Earlier in the day, Vice President Harris at her hotel in Paris, speaking with reporters about the trip and her meeting with the President Macron on Wednesday.
Hi, guys. Hi. Vice President Harris, what are you hoping to get out of this trip, achieve out of it?
Well, we have such a long-standing and very important relationship with France. And last night is evidence of the history and also our current relationship and our commitment to a new era and continuing the partnership to address the challenges that we face and also the opportunities of this moment. I really enjoyed the bilateral because it was comprehensive, it was in depth, we covered a lot of topics, and we came out of it with agreements. For example, the President, Macron, has expressed his intention to join the Artemis Accords. As the head of the Space Council, I can tell you we're very excited about the prospect of that and the work that we can do together as it relates to the opportunities that are presented in the work that we do in space. The time that we spent together included also not only the 90 minutes, it ended up being 90 minutes of our bilateral meeting, but also the time that we spent where he gave me a tour of the palace. And it was a great conversation. We covered a lot of topics. I'll tell you, at the point that we got to de Gaulle's desk, it was there that we had a comprehensive conversation about not only science, but this new era. I thought of it in the context of what I've read about de Gaulle, and he said, you know, there are 3 things that you have to keep intact as it relates to Paris, and it's the university, it's the Eiffel Tower, and Pasteur Institute, and that prompted a discussion about our long-standing commitment going back to Ben Franklin on the issue of scientific research and medical research, and what we are prepared to do to address the next pandemic through pandemic preparedness, but also, again, the relationship that France and the United States have in working together to address the issues affecting our partners around the world, and I'll speak more about that this evening.
Perfect.
So it was a good meeting.
Vice President, will high inflation make it more difficult to get Build Back Better through moderates?
Vice President Kamala Harris with reporters at her hotel in Paris. She later spoke at the Paris Peace Forum, a yearly get-together of political and private sector leaders, urging them to see the coronavirus pandemic as an opportunity to correct inequalities around the world. She mentioned gender, wealth, and food among those inequalities. Vice President Harris also today committing the U.S. to sign on to the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. That's something that former President Donald Trump did not do. CNN explains that the Paris Call seeks to make the internet a greater force for stability at a time when election meddling and ransomware attacks are commonplace. And some news here back in Washington about the House investigation into the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. A federal appeals court now granting former President Trump's request to temporarily block the release of his White House records to lawmakers. The National Archives was set to begin doing that on Friday. Former President Trump claiming the records are protected by executive privilege. So far, the courts have not agreed. The case continues on appeal. Washington Today continues in a minute.
This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang argues that America's current economic and political systems are outdated and offers suggestions on how to transform both to address 21st century challenges.
And again, I'm not after 3 parties. I think there should be 5 parties or 7 parties. And if we had that, then you'd have shifting coalitions, just like our founding fathers envisioned. Our founding fathers, if they woke up today, they would be shocked and horrified by the fact that we have these 2 parties that are just going to clash until we're all in a country that we're not going to be able to recognize and we're not going to be excited to pass on to our kids.
Hear more on this week's Afterwards podcast. Find it and follow wherever you get your podcasts. And find it on the C-SPAN Now app.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. United Nations Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland, finishing up this week, or at least they expect to. May go on a little bit longer. Washington Post writing, success or failure of the COP26, as the official name, is in the hands of world leaders and their negotiating teams. They are trying to hammer out a deal to avert catastrophic climate change as the 2-week global summit nears its end. Along with COP President Alok Sharma, UN Secretary General Antonio Gutteres delivered remarks to encourage governments to move quicker and with greater ambition. Here's some of the comments from Secretary Gutteres.
The announcements here in Glasgow are encouraging, but they are far from enough. The emissions gap remains a devastating threat. The finance and adaptation gap represent a glaring injustice for the developing world. We need even more ambition in future revised nationally determined contributions. And we need pledges to be implemented. We need commitments to turn concrete. We need actions to be verified. And we need to bridge the deep and real credibility gap. As an engineer, I know that durable structures need solid foundations. We must be able to measure progress and to adjust when off track. We have a critical mass of global commitments to net zero from both governments and non-state actors. We must now zoom in on the quality and the implementation of plans, on measuring and analyzing, on reporting, transparency and accountability. And that is why, beyond the mechanisms already set out in the Paris Agreement, I've decided to establish a high-level expert group to propose clear standards to measure and analyze net zero commitments from non-state actors. The high-level expert group will build on existing work and submit a series of recommendations to me during the course of next year. And they will work in a transparent and inclusive manner, and I invite you all to cooperate fully in their establishment and then with them. We need action if commitments are to pass the credibility test. We need to hold each other accountable, governments, non-state actors, and the civil society. Because only together can we keep 1.5 degrees within reach and the equitable and resilient world we need.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Gutteres. He also did an interview with the Associated Press in which he, quoting from the article AP wrote, warned that a key temperature goal in climate talks is on life support, but he still hopes that world governments will step up their pledges to slash emissions of greenhouse gases. Gutteres said the negotiations set to end Friday in Glasgow, Scotland, will very probably not yield the carbon-cutting pledges he has said are needed to keep the planet from warming beyond the 1.5-degree threshold. A story at Religious News Service. Jeff Bezos was a surprise guest at a Washington National Cathedral forum on Our Future in Space Wednesday evening, giving an interviewer the chance to grill the Amazon founder and spaceflight entrepreneur about extraterrestrial colonies, alien life, and his own wealth. Adi Ignatius, editor-in-chief of Harvard Business Review, questioned Bezos, who was introduced as an astronaut before the sprawling crowd, about his trip to space this summer aboard a rocket built by Blue Origin, the private spaceflight company Bezos founded in 2000. Bezos spoke of the overview effect, a profound and sometimes spiritual feeling experienced by many astronauts as they gaze upon the Earth from above. That was from Religious News Services. C-SPAN was there.
Everybody who has been to space tells you that they experience something that has come to be known as the overview effect. And I thought Senator Nelson did an amazing job describing that. I was expecting that, and I wanted to feel that, and I was ready for it. And what I can tell you is that the magnitude of that experience was so much bigger than I could have ever anticipated. And it really is such a change in perspective that shows you in a very powerful and emotional way just how fragile this Earth is. And I wish everybody could have that perspective. We've sent 8 people up so far, and we hope to send many more. But each one of those people comes back an ambassador for Earth. And it's a very dramatic feeling. We sit here and the atmosphere looks so big, this planet looks so big from the ground. But up there, what you see is the immense blackness of space, this tiny little cradle. In fact, that's why the name Blue Origin, our origin is this blue planet. And this is the most precious planet in the world, and we have to preserve it and conserve it and make sure that our children and their children and so on have this beauty in their lives.
Jeff Bezos. A question later in this interview concerned whether the money to put people into space could be better spent on Earth.
So there are, plenty of critics who will say that, the people in the private sector are spending so much money, in space. We have lots of problems on Earth. Shouldn't those resources couldn't they be used more effectively to solve the problems on Earth rather than, these sort of fantastic ventures into space? What do you say to that?
I say they're missing the duality that we need to do both, and that the two things are deeply connected. I'm actually spending even more money on the Bezos Earth Fund than I'm spending on space, and that is about climate change and about nature and conserving nature and using natural solutions to help climate change. About $3 billion of the $10 billion in the Bezos Earth Fund is going to go for nature-based solutions. We need to conserve what we still have. We need to restore what we've lost. And we need to completely transform our food systems and grow what we need to live in a new way that doesn't degrade the Earth. So there's a tremendous amount to be done in the here and now. And we cannot forget about that. But at the same time, in a deeply connected way, we need to look to the future. And we humans have always done both things. We've always looked at the here and now, and we've always looked out to the future. And this planet is so small. If we want to keep growing as a civilization, using more energy as a civilization, most of that in the future needs to be done off-planet.
Jeff Bezos and Adi Ignatius. Bezos' Amazon and Blue Origin founder Ignatius, Harvard Business Review, and event Wednesday night at Washington National Cathedral. A SpaceX Crew Dragon mission lifted off Wednesday, docking this Thursday night with the International Space Station. 4 astronauts on board, 3 Americans, 1 European. C-SPAN TV will be carrying it live, and if you miss any of the coverage, the video will be posted at our video library, cspan.org. Wall Street today, the Dow was down 158, NASDAQ up 81, S&P up 2. A 22-year-old college senior who was critically injured at the Astroworld Festival in Houston, Bharti Shahani, has passed away. That brings the death toll to 9 from what happened last week at the Travis Scott concert, the crowd surge. A lawyer for Shahani's family calling her a shining star in the community. Hundreds of others at the concert have been injured. Criminal investigation into the deaths at Astroworld is underway. At the same time, Texas Governor Greg Abbott creating the Texas Task Force on Concert Safety. He was interviewed Wednesday night on NBC5 TV, Dallas-Fort Worth.
What happened is horrible. It is a tragedy. There are literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of parents in the state who have their children go off to concerts and they expect to see their child come back home, not trampled to death. What happened in Houston cannot be replicated. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area alone, there are at a minimum dozens, maybe around 100 venues that provide concerts like this. And we want to make sure, whether it's in Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, or any place in the entire state of Texas, that we are setting standards to make sure that we will not see a repeat of what happened in Houston. As a result, we announced this task force today that will be headed by the Texas Music Office Director, and will bring together people like the firefighters, the fire marshals that set the occupancy codes and the ones who monitor whether or not there is overcrowding or not, whether or not it is safe or not safe. We will also bring in law enforcement officers and state agencies as well as music industry leaders. And we will make sure that we look at what happened in Houston, and then we talk to all these experts, and then we set standards to make sure that all music venues in the state will follow standards that will ensure the safety of the kids who go see these concerts.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott. The task force expected to hold several roundtable discussions analyzing concert safety and ways to enhance security at live music events before producing a report. Associated Press from Johannesburg, South Africa. F.W. de Klerk, who shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Nelson Mandela and as South Africa's last apartheid president oversaw the end of the country's white minority rule, has died at the age of 85. Frederick Wilhelm de Klerk died after battle against cancer at his home in Cape Town, a spokesman for his foundation confirming today. De Klerk was South African president 1989 through 94. In 1999, he was on C-SPAN's Washington Journal morning program talking about his autobiography, The Last Trek, A New Beginning, and a caller asked him when and why he came to oppose the apartheid system.
I'd like you to please explain to us, as a former leader of the ruling party in South Africa and as someone who presided over the dismantling of apartheid, at what point did you reach a conscious decision in your heart and in your mind that apartheid was a racist policy and was wrong?
Thank you. I did not have a Damascus Road experience. I really, in a nutshell, can't reply to your question. That is what my book is about. In the book, I project myself and the de Klerk family, starting in 1688, as the typical moderate Afrikaner family, and try to describe the various phases in our history, and then obviously the major part of the book is about the last 50 years, the phases, the development in our thinking, how the signs of the times, the spirit of the times changed in the early 50s, how we fell behind, how there started a process of self-analysis within the National Party, how I became part as a young member of Parliament of this process of looking at ourselves, of realizing that somehow or another we're not achieving the high ideals we had, and that is to bring justice to all South Africans through the building of new nation states. How when I was a young minister after I was appointed to the cabinet, I served on a committee where we really took a hard look at ourselves and said, are we succeeding? We cannot go on as we're going on. We're becoming more and more isolated. Somehow or another, we're not convincing the majority of black South Africans that the solution of self-determination within own states bound together into something like the European Union is the right route to take. How already in 1986, the National Party, and I was then one of the leaders of the party, already not the leader-in-chief, formally abandoned the policy of apartheid, of separate development. And already in August 86 accepted a new vision of one united South Africa with one citizenship, with all forms of racial discrimination to be removed, with one person, one vote, but with the effective protection of our various minorities. And then it was my privilege to take this new vision and to implement it when I became president in 1989. So it was a process, not only an individual process for me, but a process through which my party and my fellow leaders and the broad leadership of my party also went. But there I describe in the book personal moments, how my interaction with my clients, my black clients and Indian clients and colored clients when I started up as a young lawyer, a young solicitor, how that already changed me, how that took me out of the behind the walls behind which I grew up in a secluded situation. But I also describe how in my early political years, interaction with other young dynamic leaders from other population groups started to awaken my conscience. So it was a process, no sudden moment, no sudden Damascus Road experience.
F.W. de Klerk, former president of South Africa, on C-SPAN's Washington Journal morning program in 1999. He has died today at the age of 85. His appearance on that program coming 5 years after he left the presidency. De Klerk sharing the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize with Nelson Mandela, who then went on the next year to become the South African's first president of the country in post-apartheid multiracial elections. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a longtime South African activist, saying today of de Klerk, the former president occupied an historic but difficult space in South Africa. Although some South Africans found the global recognition of Mr. de Klerk hard to accept, Mr. Mandela himself praised him for his courage in seeing the country's political transformation process through. Thanks for listening today to Washington Today. For more top Washington stories, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at c-span.org/connect. And I hope you have a good night.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we take your calls live on the air on the news of the day, and we discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Friday morning, Boston University's School of Public Health Dean Dr. Sandro Galea discusses his book, The Contagion Next Time, on the COVID-19 pandemic and preventing another worldwide health crisis. Then Truckload Carriers Association's Dave Heller on vaccine mandates and the trucking industry. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Friday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our new mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, text messages, and tweets.